Don't Come to the Midwest, Part 1, written by WeirdBryceGuy. I've lived in the Midwest for most of my life, this persistence of location only being momentarily broken by a 2-year experience in a more westward state of no importance to the story. I only mention this because if I had lived in Missouri for an unbroken time, I think I would have been fully susceptible to the preternatural forces from whom I escaped last night. I'll try my best to recount what happened, and hopefully you'll heed my warning and never venture to this terrible space in the middle of the United States. Last night around 6 p.m., I had made the decision to go for a walk. It's nearing the end of May, and the nighttime doesn't really begin until the closing minutes of 7 p.m. So I had a decent amount of time to venture out without the need of unnatural illumination. The neighborhood in which I live is a somewhat large upper-middle suburban area, a subdivision divided into several smaller pockets of housing across a large expanse of hilly, intermittently forested land. These little islands of nature are composed of densely packed trees and low foliage, and there are dens of whatever animals are brave enough to still linger among the encroaching civilization. My walk led me to one such area, the one closest to my house, and through which I've often ventured during the early mornings when the light filters beautifully through the treetops. I hadn't been through there at night before though, and I figured I'd see what the inverse experience was like. It was, and will most likely remain to be, the worst decision of my life. A man-made path led through this and the other natural aisles, connecting them with the neighborhoods around them. The one nearest to my home happened to be the largest and acted as a rough center to this nexus of civilization and nature. My walk led me to the base of this small wood, and the darkness therein was deep. Despite the still present sun overhead, I couldn't see much beyond the paths before and behind me, and the branching avenues that led to the other collections of housing all terminated in the shadows around me. I wasn't initially disturbed by the darkness, nor had I been dissuaded by it from continuing on. But something about the nature of the darkness had felt unusual. I don't mean that it felt sinister or alive, or that it hid something terrible, but that an element of it didn't seem natural. Darkness can be described as the absence of light, a simple definition that needs no greater elaboration, assuming that you understand what light is and isn't. Down there, in the undarkened micro-valley where the paths converged, the darkness didn't feel like the absence of light, but instead a distortion of it. I, standing there amidst the trees and bushes, still felt illuminated, still felt some sort of radiance fall upon my body. I wouldn't say that I felt like I was being observed by something. Again, the darkness wasn't a shade that concealed an evil. It was more like a spectral emission analogous to light, in some weird, otherworldly way. I continued on in my trek, my desire for an evening walk still very much alive, and eventually descended to the spot where I sat during the mornings to appreciatively gaze around as the rising sun's light did its slow, kaleidoscopic wash across the environment. It was here that I encountered the horror that compelled me to tell this story, and hopefully to discourage you from ever setting foot in the Midwest, or at least Missouri. Across from the rock on which I sat, there was another small clumping of rocks that mirrored my own, and on them sat a figure. I couldn't make out a single discernible thing about his appearance, and then I came to realize that he was entirely black. I don't mean like racially black, but his skin, clothing, eyes, hair, everything about him had been black, as if it was colored in totally. I could only tell that it was a he, and even now, away from that place, I sometimes doubt myself, perhaps for the sake of my continued sanity, because its body was similar to my own. Height, form, even the way that he turned his head to observe the trees. All of his mannerisms were uncomfortably similar to my own. Behind him, for the first time since entering, I noticed that his background was not consistent with my own, where mine carried the mixed hues of purple and orange, signaling the arrival of sunset. His background held the same disquieting darkness, but it was magnified to astral degrees as the sky behind him opened to display it tenfold. His immediate backdrop, too, imparted that singular sense of a weird inversion of light, where the darkness seemed not to be darkness as we know it, but as if it was the light of another, bizarre world. When my eyes returned to the figure, he had arisen from his seat and had started walking towards me. And at that moment, I fled, terror-stricken and senseless, because I had immediately sensed what he intended to do. Often during my rest there, I came across some cute woodland creature, and I guess due to my passive, non-intimidating nature, they never fled from me, and they even sometimes allowed me to pet them or feed them small nuts and berries that littered the ground. For him, I sat where such an animal would, when mirrored, and in his hand was a small object, black as the fingers that held it, and it was pulsating. I spent the rest of the night and most of this morning searching online for similar occurrences, and I have since found only 3 comparable incidents. The same weird darkness and a figure who resembles the observer. I've contacted the people behind those stories, and they have all confirmed that their stories also took place within the Midwest, with one happening in Kansas and the other 2 in Missouri. The only difference between my story and theirs is that the circumstances of their interactions were much, much more frightening. And in the case of the Kansas story, the witness had even heard some obscene, irreproducible sounds from where his darkness-subsumed doppelganger had sat. Each one told me that they never left the Midwest, and I believe that I was spared their greater horrors because I have. So, please do not come here. When people tell you that the Midwest is boring, you don't have to believe them, but heed the spirit of dissuasion. There's a neighborhood meeting coming up in a few weeks, and one of the topics to discuss will be the further expansion of neighborhood facilities. I've never actually attended one of these meetings, but you can bet that I'll be there, campaigning for a pool or playground or whatever structure could get that space near my house uprooted and concreted. Don't Come to the Midwest, Part 2, written by WeirdBryceGuy. I've searched for the proper place to post this. Hopefully here, where others seem to have experienced this similarly terrifying and inexplicable things, my story will find a home. If anyone can help or has any information regarding these things, please message me or comment. I live in Missouri. I've tried Googling similar incidents and have come across a few, even one here, but there's no answer on how to stop them. I've adopted the title of the tagged post in hopes that our stories are somehow related. I'm 24 years old, and until yesterday, I hadn't believed in the paranormal. Last night, I stayed at a friend's house playing MTG and watching Star Trek, and eating spicy boneless chicken wings. It's my weekend, as in I have 2 consecutive days off, yesterday being the first. My friend is simply unemployed and invited me over to have the brand of fun that 2 antisocial, sci-fi and fantasy-obsessed people are inclined to have. At some point in the night, alcohol had been introduced, and the fun was given an added layer of juvenile delight, as the cheap whiskey mixed with the wings in our bellies, and then resulted in the most lethal expulsions of gas. Farting, throwing cards at each other like bladed disc, and emulating Picard, with not-so-bad vocal mimicry. Two guys enjoying life as well as they could. At some point around 2 a.m., my friend suggested that we go outside and relax. That we let the wind and cool air sober us up a bit so that we could play video games later. I agreed, and we headed out onto his back patio, where two metal chairs with comfy padding sat facing away from the house towards a steep hill that terminated in a dense wood. Only the initial face of the tree line was visible. The interior of the small forest virtually blacked out by an impenetrable darkness. As we sat there, we spoke of insubstantial things, often having to repeat ourselves due to our shared inebriation. Something about the tightly packed wood kept drawing my eye to it, and while my friend seemed totally oblivious to the natural allure, I grew increasingly distracted by it, to the point where my friend thought that I had blacked out. He nudged my shoulder with a beer bottle, and my captivation by the forest was temporarily broken by my annoyance at him. He suggested that we come out here to sober up, but beneath his chair I saw another 6-pack of beer. 2 of the slots were already empty. "Bro, you good?" He slurred, his eyes narrowed, presumably due to me being a shifty, if not altogether immaterial, form in his very drunk sight. I responded that I was, and without seeming not good, turned his attention to the woods and asked if he saw anything weird about them. He looked and didn't speak for a while. Then with a great huff and heave, he launched the bottle into the woods. Now, I'm not exactly the most ecologically concerned citizen, but for some reason I felt that this was wrong, that he had done something almost profane. I waited for the tink of the bottle smashing into a tree, or the thud of it hitting the ground somewhere, but neither happened. There wasn't a sound that followed the bottle's descent, and my friend isn't some great athlete, so the distance that it traveled couldn't have been out of earshot. Again, my friend didn't notice the weirdness about this, and he began cracking open another not-so-cold one. To calm my unease, I gestured towards him, and he supplied me with one as well. We continued to drink, all thoughts of returning inside erased by the calming swill. About 10 minutes later, we ran out of beer. Bored and probably dangerously intoxicated, we decided to enter the dark woods downhill. I don't remember who suggested this, and it really doesn't matter. It happened, and I have to live with it. Beerless and fearless, we scrambled down the hill. I'm honestly surprised that we didn't break our necks then, and we pushed through the tall foliage. Once past the initial tree line, I felt immediately sober, and this sobering set off a series of instinctual, primitive alarms in the recesses of my mind. A perception of something other than us. The anticipation of its arrival had cleared my mind, drained my brain of the intoxicant, and that terrified me. I looked to my friend, whose head had lolled around as he tried to reconcile his footing. It was apparent that he had not been as affected as I had. I wouldn't call myself a sensitive person. Sensitive in the sense that practitioners of the paranormal use the word. A usage more akin to susceptible to events and phenomena of that nature. So I'm not exactly sure why I was instilled with the sudden clarity of thought and the apprehension of environment. Undeterred, my friend continued on, stumbling and pitching bodily, forcing me to shadow him as to prevent his broken neck should he fall down some unseen pit. For what felt like an hour, we walked in this way until we came across what I can only still describe as a blackish wall. It spanned an immeasurable distance, left to right, and allowed for a very limited visibility through it. This partial translucency was almost membranous. We could see more woods beyond it, but the veil that separated that portion from ours seemed to almost vibrate, as if some current within it surged through. I don't know how long we stood there, staring at the shivering wall, but eventually my friend blurted out, "All right, let's check it out." and before I could express how utterly insane such a course of action would be, my friend was struck in the head by a small, black object. He fell back and landed hard on his butt, and rather than cry out in surprise or pain, he let loose a grumbling burp, followed by a fiendish cackle. I couldn't believe how such a thing could be whimsical to him, but he laughed uncontrollably, and only after being shaken out of his fit did he finally settle down and acknowledge the violence that had occurred. We looked for the object and found it a few yards away, and I don't think that either of us in our disparate states of consciousness really recognized it at first. It was only when I picked it up and held it in the moonlight that it became recognizable. I dropped it as soon as this recognition sat in. It was a beer bottle, in the shape of one at least. But the whole thing was entirely black. Label and glass the same color, with no visible distinction between the two very different materials. This finally unnerved my friend enough to instill some level of sobriety in him. And to my relief, he muttered, "Let's get out of here." And I happily agreed, and we turned away from the strange wall and the bottle and chalked both up to the alcohol, even though I felt perfectly sober. As we climbed the hill that led up to his backyard, I felt a strange imitation of darkness, like the sky had suddenly grown overcast and it shadowed me, but not the ground on which I walked. I looked up and I saw nothing, and then I turned around. And I'm sure I looked like some wild animal as I scrambled up the hill on all fours, practically barking at my friend to follow me back into his house. While on that hill, when I had turned, I saw two figures exiting the tree line. One staggered about, listing haphazardly. His companion strode on soberly and appeared to be on edge. Both, despite the illuminating moonlight, were impossibly black from flesh to clothing. This alone would have made any man ascend the hill the way that I did. But what propelled me up that slope with almost inhuman speed was their familiar gaits. The sober one strode on just as my friend did when not drunk off his ass, and the other stumbled in my signature drunken way, taking steps too far apart in a silly attempt to steady myself. I don't know if they've climbed the hill, what they want, or what they really are. My friend has finally fallen asleep on his bed, 2 hours after re-entering his house and barricading all the entrances. He had the alcohol to assist him in sleep. My unnaturally earned sobriety didn't allow me that privilege. The sounds of beer bottles colliding with the walls of the house and the deep, distorted laughter of the throwers has ensured that I won't be asleep anytime soon. The crashes have gone on for hours now. Hundreds of tinks and clinks, and I don't foresee them stopping anytime soon. The sun should have made its appearance by now, but it's like the night has cycled and the darkness outside is growing thicker. At this point, I think I'd rather be asleep when it reaches total blackness. I don't want to be conscious to see whatever comes along with it. Don't Come to the Midwest, Part 3, written by WeirdBryceGuy. I'm stuck here between this massive pulsating black sphere and my doppelganger of equal blackness, who wanders through the building behind me. The observation tent in which I've hidden myself is stocked with provisions, battery-operated communication devices, and strange armaments of some kind. They don't appear to be functional. The computer I'm currently using has access to both the internet and a local network, and this site was the only open tab in the already open browser. At first, I assumed that its previous user had been doing some recreational browsing, but after reading what they had accessed here, I see that they'd been studying something, a pattern of events seemingly related to the events unfolding around me. I feel safe for now, but something tells me that circumstances will change soon. So, I'll tell my story and add it here to this apparent archive of horror. I live in Kansas, in a deeply rural community about 30 miles from the nearest major city. My home rests in a clearing enclosed by scattered placements of thick, towering bur oak and cottonwood trees, which span in all directions for miles, making up a humble forest. About 6 miles south of my home begins a trail, which leads through the woods and eventually ends up at an easily traversable river. Across this river, and past a crumbling, long-abandoned farmstead lies a manhole, one unmarked by any notation of purpose or signage. During one of my day's walks, I stumbled upon this manhole and, with nothing better to do on a Monday afternoon, decided to do a bit of subterranean exploration. I entered, followed a straight yet gradual sloping tunnel, and about 2 miles later I emerged above ground before a sprawling brick compound. It was moss-covered, weathered, and ugly. The building was nature-claimed and in a state of total disrepair, at least on the outside. A parking lot lay in front with enough spaces for 12 cars, and branching from this was a drive-through that curled around to the right side of the building, meeting a sort of intake bay. The front double doors, covered in lichen and blocked by heavy debris from what seemed to be a collapsed archway, was impassable, so I decided to investigate the side door from the drive-through entrance. Through this accessible entrance was a small vestibule, still lit by a single dome light on the ceiling. A terminal sat against the wall facing towards the outside. There was a sign-in sheet, a handheld device of some kind, and a cracked, featureless coffee mug. No signatures had been made on the sheet for 3 days, and the last sign-in was done by a man named Austin Christ. The previous names were indecipherable, as the ink seemed to have been purposely smudged. I pressed on, somewhat allured by the mysterious and slightly foreboding atmosphere of the derelict facility. Past the vestibule, which held nothing of interest besides the terminal, was a featureless corridor that extended for several paces and then led to a sort of reception area. Chairs and papers and cardboard boxes were upturned and strewn about and flattened all about the area respectively. There weren't any signs of a fight or actual violence that I could see. There was no blood nor indication of damage beyond the aforementioned mess. A computer sat on a receptionist's desk, but the tower had been taken, leaving only the unplugged monitor. Growing uneasy, I left the room and followed another corridor which eventually led to a sort of cargo staging area. Along the left and right walls were machines which I can only guess were used for moving large containers. And directly ahead of me was one such container. It had thick metal seals that latched its lid shut, and its proportions were similar to that of a dumpster. Across its face was displayed EAM Shipment Container in large yellow letters. Every other aspect of the box was stark black. A vague fear overcame me, and I continued past the box and into the next room. Through the door was another reception area like the one through which I had previously traveled, although smaller, with thousands of small bulbs affixed to the walls. The floor was a thick, completely transparent glass, and beneath it were more of the bulbs. A metal desk dented inwards in its center was the only object. Directly ahead, through a sort of vacuum-sealed portal, was what appeared to be an inoperable decontamination area, and then the back of the facility. A fenced-in outside lot held nothing but the aforementioned spear, and the observation tent in which I've presently sealed myself. I stepped through the threshold and approached the spear, after noting the tent to my right. It was a totally black orb that pulsated silently, and it was about double the size of a construction wrecking ball. There was no visible apparatus which could have held the thing in the air, and its unnatural suspension set my nerves aflame. Another unusual aspect of the spear was that it emitted a light. And I say it in this manner because this emission did not illuminate anything, but instead actually darkened the space around it, not as a shadow being cast from an object, but as a darkness emitting from the object. Now, I know this sounds crazy, but it's the best way that I can describe the phenomena. A blackened brilliance, if I may be humbly literary. I retreated back inside the building, forgetting to explore the tent in my timid flight from the spear's inverted radiance. I wish that I hadn't, if only to save myself the sight of that horror. I returned to the cargo loading room to find the black container opened, its lid thrown back towards me. I hadn't heard anything denoting another inhabitant of the facility, and there were no signs of forced entry. Whomever had opened the box had done so through its intended means of access. This unsettled me, and I moved around to inspect the contents. I would have screamed if I had had the breath in my lungs to do so. Squatting in the box, eyes as black as the spear. In fact, everything about it was a mirror image of myself. Its clothing hung slightly too loose from its body, the same as mine, due to my lack of appetite since the death of my father a few months ago. Its hair was short and curly, but sable strands replaced my oak-brown tufts. His hands were pressed against his cheeks, and his eyes stared up at me dumbly. Despite being a perfect, if completely black-colored copy, I didn't get the feeling that this thing was alive. In stupidity or perhaps curiosity-compelled courage, often indistinguishable during times of imminent peril, I touched the figure. If regret had a champion, I would carry its banner perennially. The moment my finger poked its scalp, at the precise instance of contact, it yelled. A deep, bellowed exhalation that blasted my ears, sending me reeling back in auditory bewilderment. Without ceasing that awful sound, it rose and stepped through the container, as if it had no interest in the collision of physical matter. Seeing this and regaining some of my sense, I sprinted past the figure who had made no attempts to restrain me. Before I realized it to be my desired destination, I had entered the observation tent. The shouting figure did not pursue me, and with the fading of its voice, I assumed it left the cargo area through the opposite door. Seeing that the tent could be sealed, I did so. I then examined my surroundings. Aside from the things that I have mentioned at the beginning of the story, I found an old-fashioned tape recorder with a single tape within. Here's what it said.
Austin is coming in today. Clark said he's here due to routine analysis of the EAM, but I don't believe it. Austin only comes in when we mess something up, which we've been doing a lot of these last 2 years. The really weird thing is that it's usually my department screwing up, but things have been pretty dull this week. The EAM hasn't emitted any new rays, and no one has succumbed to its secondary effects since the whole thing with Kogs. So if Austin is here to piss on someone, it's certainly not us. I hope he brings in another shipment of suits. This extra mundane stuff is corrosive, and it eats through whatever we put on in minutes. We haven't been able to have a single expedition last longer than 8 minutes before that stuff starts seeping in or outright eats through the material. There's an expedition scheduled for tomorrow, and I'm on the list to take point. The last expedition extracted a sample, put it in one of those containers. They say that it's lined with some sort of triple reinforced metal, but I've seen the way it eats through everything. They better get their scans and dump it in some sort of off-site hole before that stuff gets out in there. That's pretty much it for today. Hopefully I don't make an ass of myself tomorrow. Nico, 05-28-19, out.
After listening to the tape, I turned on the monitor and came across this website. Resolving to stay here until the voice of that thing becomes completely inaudible, I decided to record my experience, hopefully leaving a supplementary record to the incidents already mentioned here, which I believe to be connected to my own. To those of you that have witnessed these things, if you're still alive, I wish you the best of luck in your escape from them. My escape, I fear, will not be easy, if even possible. Anyway, goodbye and good luck. Blake.